allow me to introduce Marc Wayshack. We've been on each other's podcasts. We go way back. Marc today is talking about discovery. And as I was like how to run an effective discovery meeting, and as I was talking about when Aaron and I were talking about, this is quite possibly one of the most important elements of the predictable revenue formula. If you missed that talk, a real quick summary is book a ton of meetings, work each of those meetings to the best possible outcome, and then give it the appropriate amount of time and investment. And if you do those three things, you're going to achieve predictable revenue. But if you miss one of those three things, these three elements multiply by each other, or multiply together. And so if you're booking a ton of meetings, but you are not following the advice that Marc is going to give you, you're going to multiply all of your efforts, all your sales development team's efforts by zero. And everything is going to null out. And so this is such a crucial talk because it's the key. It's one of those main elements to predictable revenue. We've talked a little bit about Marc's YouTube channel. He's got a book, The High Velocity Sales Organization, Game Plan Selling and Breaking All Barriers. Legend on YouTube, Sales Insight Labs, contributor to HubSpot, Fast Company, all the places where you want to read content, read, see, view, listen. Marc is there. So without further ado, Marc, welcome to the stream. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Yeah, I'm so psyched to be here. And this is a topic that is a deep passion for me as well. It is so, we can obviously, just like Colin and Aaron, talked about, we've all read, Aaron's book. And, I think so many sales challenges for organizations, first is just that they don't have enough leads. That is first and foremost for many people out there. But then I think that it is such a lost opportunity when we start driving leads. And then what are we actually doing to engage those folks in conversations? And so I'm going to dive right into the program and basically what we're going to cover. So in the next 45 minutes, you're going to be able to understand the real reason that most reps aren't actually hitting their sales goals in today's marketplace, and of course, how to crush yours. Why prospects aren't interested in what you have to share with them, and how to flip the script, which is really key because I think people think in terms of tweaks, but what my goal is not just little tweaks, but really how can you entirely flip the script on prospects to get them to really engage with what you're offering. Now, we're also going to be covering how to leverage, and this is really one of the most important pieces, is how to leverage a structured sales process or a structured discovery process in order to close more sales at higher prices. And then how to escape that cycle of price pushback, think it overs, and ghosting prospects in order to ultimately close more sales. And so basically, we're going to cover everything that you need to know, not only to increase sales, but also to really just transform the way you approach sales for massive sales growth. And the data shows that the top 20% of salespeople account for more than 50% of organizations' revenues. So what top performing sales reps are doing during their discovery conversations has a massive impact on their overall sales. And so I want to first just take a step back and think about where we are right now. And I want to ask if this sounds like you, or if you've ever related to this situation where the prospect seems enthusiastic at first, but then after you present or you do a demo or you pitch, they suddenly disappear. Or how about that they ask you for that proposal, but then they tell you that they're going to get back to you, and then we just never hear from them again. They ghost, they're gone. Or what about when they say that they want all of the value, but then they push back on price? We hear this constantly. And, ultimately, there are certain things that we can be doing to just completely change that. Or how about, have we ever been in a situation where, you just feel like another vendor that's just trying to beg your way into a sale, and you only find out that the prospect has ultimately been just working you for all of your valuable information. So you're doing all this great lead gen, and then suddenly, you feel like you're getting worked. Or lastly, have you ever gone through that entire sales process with all the signs seeming to be a go, and then you just find out at the very end that there's a timing or a budget, or just, the offering is just not right. And so let's identify what the real problem is, because what we find is that when you're hearing issues like that, it means that we're stuck in that old approach to discovery or that old approach to selling. And so we haven't applied the new model that gives you full control over every sales opportunity. And so, key number one to being effective in terms of better discovery, just better at sales in general, is that we've got to avoid the old approach at all costs. And it's so important that we understand what that old approach actually is. And so let me just walk you through what the old approach really looks like. And maybe you'll relate to it, maybe you won't. But it's really important to recognize it so we can avoid it. The first is, haphazard prospecting, which we're not going to be talking about today. That's been covered by other folks in terms of what's your lead gen process and who are the types of folks that you're actually talking to. Let's just assume that that's all dialed in right now. But then the old approach goes to one of two places. We either immediately we get someone a live body with a pulse, right? And they're basically saying, yeah, I'll talk to you. And then we immediately pitch. We're like, oh, well, let me tell you all the amazing things that we can do for you. And we're so great and we're awesome. And, let me show you the 5 reasons that we can help you, right? And it's like hardcore pitch. And immediately the prospect is like, whoa, 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 whoa. I hear this all the time. And they're like kind of, it's overwhelming to get that hardcore pitch. It's not genuine, right? So then the other piece to the old approach, which is the other side of it, is the probing approach. So there's really two, we always think, and this is really something that we've identified in the past few years, is that basically 3/4 of salespeople or 2/3 of salespeople go into the pitching approach. And then the other third of less effective reps try to go into the probing approach. And let me explain to you what the probing approach is. The probing approach is like, hey, could we hop on a call so I can learn more about your business and show you how we can help you? And the prospect's like, dude, I don't want to get on a call to teach you about my business. Right. Or, like the old, like, hey, I want to find out what's keeping you up at night. And the prospect's like, uh, no, like you haven't shown me any value. So why the hell would I jump on a call? And then from there, most salespeople go into a presentation, right? They open up their jacket pocket and they talk about all the features and benefits of what they offer. From there, because we haven't really identified what's going on, there are a slew of objections to be dealt with. And so it becomes this arm wrestling match of back and forth. And then we go to that hard close, right? It's like, what can I do today to get you to buy? This is again the old approach. And then because there was no sale being made, because the prospect has to think about it, because they don't feel like they can make an informed decision, we go into follow-up mode. And so suddenly we're like just constantly following up on our prospects. And so I imagine there are so many people that are like have this huge follow-up list of people that they're calling, and it's a really common issue. And so this is the old approach to selling. And so what we have to identify is that the data shows us that only about 37% of salespeople are consistently effective in the eyes of prospects. And the majority of behaviors that salespeople are actually engaging in is actually hurting the sale. And we've recently done some data that shows that when we ask prospects or the average prospect, how they identify the average salesperson, these are the words that they use to describe them, right? Pushy, annoying, taking up time, they're greedy, they're always trying to go for this sale, they're selfish, right? So this is what we're dealing with in the marketplace. So regardless of where your leads are coming from, now you have this guarded prospect in front of you who's like, all right, I need to protect myself. And so the prospect is like literally like arms crossed, like window up, and they're just like, okay, so like, what do you got? Right? They're like, they play hardball because they've been burned so many times, because they've dealt with so many salespeople who are just using this old school crap approach. And so when we move to the new model, what we see, and that's what the rest of this is going to be focused on, is that new model. What we see is that you suddenly have so much more control over every sales opportunity, and you can avoid most of those objections in the first place. That's what a great discovery does, is it allows you to actually avoid those objections in the first place. And then you can stop wasting your time with unqualified prospects that are just taking your information, your time, and your sanity. And you can, what we'll talk about in a minute, you can disqualify those people. And I'll show you exactly how you do that. And then you can ultimately sell your offer at higher prices to people that actually value what you have to offer. Because because you've done that thorough discovery conversation and you've earned that thorough discovery conversation. And so you can finally control and stabilize your income because you know that you're generating and you're closing sales. So again, the data shows that just 18% of salespeople are seen by buyers as actually trusted advisors whom they respect. And so, what I'm going to show you over the course of our time together, it does work, but you must use it. So, I just want to show you a few quick case studies that demonstrate how this really works. And so, I want to just share with you the story of Andrew, who was able to, as a result of this model, was able to close more sales in just the last few months than in the past year, simply as a result of using this disqualification technique, which I'll show you about. Or, how about Andrew Jensen, other Andrew, who went from only hitting 30% of quota to 206%. And again, it was about using that process to not just give a demo and a presentation, but to really understand what was going on in the prospect's world. Or lastly, the example of Frank, right, who was able to hit 160% of goal and is leading his organization, again, by dropping the old approach and instead using a model that is really engaging prospects in conversations. So I just show you that not to brag in any way, but just to show you that this can be done. And so what's the actual new model? That's what we're going to be focused on for the rest here. And so the first is that we need to have a sales process that actually creates value in the eyes of your prospects. So I'm actually going to demonstrate for you and show you what that sales process looks like. But you must have your sales process in the first place. You must have that process in place. So we've got to stop winging that sales discovery process and actually have an approach, right? Do you have a script that you're using? And by the way, not like a script where like every single word is scripted out, but do you have a set of questions that you're asking every single time? And prospects really do need to see genuine value in talking to you because they're not looking for new friends. And we'll dig into that in just a minute. And lastly, is that if you can't describe your sales process in 4 to 5 concise and well thought out steps, then you're in trouble. So you've got to have your sales process. Let me actually show you what the sales process looks like. So this is our sales process that we use. And this is really about disqualify. This is about discovery. We use the word disqualify a lot, as you'll see in a second. And what the data shows is that the top 10% of performers have a repeatable process. And so let me just walk you through this slide a little because it's so important. So the first is that we have insight. Are you demonstrating insight to your prospects up front? Because if you're particularly with cold prospects, now if you get referred into someone or you get a hot introduction and they're just like, you've been super well set up, you don't necessarily have to be demonstrating insight. Or like if you've written a best-selling book or whatever, like suddenly you have credibility. But if you're just a salesperson who got in cold and maybe you sent a cold email and you got in the door, to just show up and be like, hey, what's going on? Like they're going to be like, whoa, I don't know who you are, or like, what's the value? So we need to be demonstrating insight. So do you have content? Do you have PDFs? Do you have a way to open the conversation that really gets the prospect talking in ways that actually shows that you know what you're doing, right? That's what insight's about. And then we go to disqualify, where we'll talk about it more throughout this time here, but this is really important, is flipping the script from trying to pitch or even qualify to instead say, is this person actually a fit, right? That's what we're trying to determine. Is the prospect actually a fit? And so it's flipping the script to be more like we want to think like a doctor, right? And then lastly is that we're solving in the presentation, which we're not really focused on today because we're focused more on that discovery process. So the discovery process is really more in this insight and disqualify phase, which we'll dig into a little bit more, or quite a bit more. So now we've got to, in terms of point number 3, we've got to drop the sales pitch. Dropping the sales pitch changes so much because your prospects are super turned off by the super duper sales guy thing, right? Do you have a couple of slides in your intro deck that are like about you, right? Or about your company, you're pitching, right? You've got to drop that stuff because ultimately fit is more important than interest, right? So, like I said here, do you have a PowerPoint slide deck that you're showing to every prospect, and the first couple of slides are about your company? If so, you're in trouble. You've got to drop that. And because, basically 80% of buyers say it's critical to interact with salespeople who are trusted advisors and not just a sales rep who's, someone who's really adding value to their business. And so we've got to drop that pitch because we're immediately losing credibility with the prospect if we're coming in and we're just like, hey, let me show you all the reasons that you need to do business with me. Does that make sense? It's so important that we drop that pitch. And then on the other side of it is we've got to drop the what's keeping you up at night thing as well, because that's killing deals as well. Um, I'll give you some examples in just a second, but the what keeps you up at night stuff, which is what our research has shown and what we see in the marketplace is there's basically like three levels of salespeople, right? You have people who are out there and are just trying to pitch any prospect who they can get in front of. It's like the old like we'll sell anything to anyone kind of approach, and that's super ineffective. Then the next level is the what keeps you up at night folks who are unfortunately pretty ineffective because they're not coming in with some value. Now, it's not to say that you don't want to be asking questions of your prospects. You absolutely do. But I'm talking about how are you opening up that discovery conversation? Are you starting that discovery conversation with what's your biggest challenge? Because if you are, chances are your prospect, if they're a high level buyer, they're not dying to just like divulge that information, right? They need to feel like, okay, this person has insight. And so, I'm willing to actually share with them information. And so the what keeps you up at night stuff is pretty problematic because you've got to offer that value before you've earned the right to ask questions. So are you doing something up front to demonstrate value at the beginning of your discovery conversations? And just, a couple of quick examples. I think of, we use something that we call a whiteboard pitch, which you can do it by Zoom. You can obviously, if you're face to face, you could do it on a napkin, you could do it on a whiteboard, you can do it in any way. And basically it's just like a 2 to 3 minute insight demonstration that is sharing, key data, key challenges that you're seeing are in the marketplace right now. And it's not talking about your product, it's not talking about you, but it's giving your prospect enough insight where they're like, oh, okay, this makes sense. So like, like a lead generation agency might like give some examples of like ideal prospects for this prospect, or like you might actually show some real data, or could do some kind of like an audit of the prospect's world or of their current marketing. That's the kind of stuff that gets prospects to be like, okay, I want to talk to you. And so again, high level buyers are too busy to teach us about their business. That's the real distinction. If you're selling to low level people, they're pretty much happy to hop on the phone with you, but they don't buy, right? Because they don't have the authority to buy. And so insight about their world really gets prospects to open up. So this isn't about teaching, but it's about just demonstrating enough insight that you can get the prospect talking and that you've earned that discovery conversation. And again, the data, we're like a data house. We just aggregate data from everywhere. We do a lot of our own data. And what we see is that only about a quarter of salespeople um, actually have an adequate understanding of prospects' business in order to demonstrate that they can really solve those problems. And so that's the key here is that we need to demonstrate some real expertise. Now, you don't have to be an expert in your prospects world, of course, but you do need to demonstrate enough insight to show that, hey, we know what we're talking about. And then, so, it might be like, hey, what we're seeing in the marketplace right now is, challenge A, challenge B, challenge C. Do any of those issues ring true to you? Right. And now the prospect is like, oh, okay, yeah, we're dealing with that. And then you can get them talking. That's the kind of stuff that's important. Not so what's keeping you up at night right now? Like, that's just like uncreative and trite and expected, particularly like in high level sales. So that brings us to point number 5. This is super hard to go through so quickly because we have such a short time here. But we want to, and this is going to be really kind of like a contrarian to a lot of people, but we want to disqualify our prospects. And so what I mean by disqualifying your prospects is that, we've all been taught to persuade or to actually qualify your prospects, but just imagine right now, right? When you put pressure on your prospects, when you're trying to get them to say yes, when you're trying to convince them to tell you yes, what is their natural inclination? It's to push back on you, right? So you see the traditional sales is this kind of pushing two, I almost picture like two like big like rhinoceroses like pushing into each other, and they're pushing back and forth, and it's this like battle. Instead, we want to take that pressure off and identify simply, are they a fit? Because our data shows that, about half of prospects aren't actually a fit for what you offer. And so what you want to do is only spend time with those qualified prospects. That's the key to this stuff. So we want to actually think like a doctor, not like the car salesman who's just trying to like close any person who's walking in the door. Because, again, our data shows that over half of your prospects are not a good fit. So let me just explain this point for a second, while we're talking, because I think it's really, I think this is like, I think you can see my screen. I'll make sure that I pin myself. Um, if we are simply getting in front of prospects and we're trying to convince them, like that cheesy old school car salesman, they're going to react very negatively. So what we want to be doing during the discovery process, and this is the key stuff, is first we're demonstrating some insight to earn the conversation. And so that might be, a quick like 2 minutes on like what we're seeing in the marketplace, um, in their marketplace. So like actual useful information. And then we're basically ending that with some version of, so did any of those issues ring true to you? And then you get them talking. And now we're asking questions to really understand what's going on. Tell me about that. Help me understand that. This is where we flip the script to the doctor's mindset, right? If you walk into a doctor's office and you're like, "Hey, doctor, my elbow hurts. I think I need surgery." The doctor's not going to be like, "Well, you know what? You're in the right place because we have this incredible new procedure called arthroscopic surgery. It's unbelievable. We go in, we fix you back up. Within a week, you're bending your elbow. Within a month, you can play tennis, right? So you're ready to do it and slide in the contract across the screen." Of course, that's not how a doctor thinks. Yet that's how so many salespeople think, is like, we literally, the prospect gives us a challenge or mentions a challenge, and we're immediately like, "Oh, well, we have the best solution for that." Or instead of just slowing it down and really doing what we call disqualifying and be like, "Help me understand that." And so I'll give you a very tangible examples, because I know, we want tangible ideas here that we can actually use. And so let me give you a very tangible example for how we would actually use this in real life. So a typical prospect question that you might get is, "Why should I do business with you?" Right? That's a common question that we get during the discovery conversation. They're like, "Yeah, so like, tell me, like, give me your pitch. Like, why should I do business with you?" And how does the average salesperson respond to the question of, "Why should I do business with you?" Most salespeople, of course, are like going into like, "Yeah, we've been around for 75 years," or like, "We've got 300 employees," or "We have Google as our like flagship client," or "We have the best service," or, "We have the best offering." And the thing is, though, is that when a salesperson starts doing what we call the tap dance, and I can't show you my tap dance on the floor, but like literally salespeople go into that tap dance, the prospect immediately walls go up, because they're like, yeah, that's what everyone says, right? Like, do you just take the idea of service, for example? If let's say you have the best service in your industry, just as an example, right? Think of one of your worst competitors, like that actually has horrible service, right? Do you think if a prospect asks the salesperson of that company, like, "So tell me about your service," do you think the salesperson's like, "Oh, so about our service, it's it's okay. It's a work in progress. No, of course not. They're like, we have the best service. Like we're the best out there. And so when we have that mindset that's about trying to convince people to do business with us, it makes us like the cheesy car sales guy. And it's crazy because I see so many gurus out there who are still teaching like this old school approach. And so what we want to do is just take that pressure off. So I digress. So now the new approach to responding to why should I do business with you should sound something like this. So prospect says, why should I do business with you? And the response should be something like this. Well, you know what, George? Really appreciate you asking me that question. Quite frankly, at this point in the conversation, I'm not sure that you should do business with me. Would it be okay if I ask some questions to understand a little bit more about what's going on to determine whether we're a fit? And now the prospect is like, oh, okay, I didn't expect that one. And now they're like, okay, sure, I'm happy to answer some questions on that. Like, because you've now, just by that simple demonstration, you've taken so much pressure off the table. And they're like, okay, yeah, I'll talk to you. That's the key to this stuff, is really lowering the pressure and having just simple strategies during that discovery conversation that really disarm the prospect. If you use that approach, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, but if you use that approach with your prospects, they're going to be like, oh, wow, this person is way more of a professional than I understood. Right. And that's exactly what we want to get to. So that's what disqualifying your prospects is all about. And again, in a really short period of time, it's hard to get like too deep into the weeds here. But so I'm keeping this so we can really just think about like how can we start to change the strategy around our discovery, and give you a couple tactics along the way. So that's about disqualifying. Now, the one of the last key pieces here is that we don't want to present. We want to solve. And so I know that this is outside of discovery, but I think that it's still a part of discovery because so many of us we get we're so excited for the presentation that we do this like super quick discovery. So take like a 45-minute sales, like let's say you're in a one call close situation. And I know most of us aren't, but let's say you're in a one call close situation. Most salespeople spend like 10 minutes in discovery and like 40 minutes or whatever, 35 minutes in presentation. I want you to flip that, where it's like 30 minutes of discovery and 10 minutes of presentation, not even like 5 minutes of presentation, and then just like Q&A. So we'll talk about what that looks like. So what you want to do is you don't want to present, but you want to solve. And so you want to take what you've learned in that discovery conversation, in that disqualification conversation, and now you want to simply demonstrate that you can solve their problem. Don't present, solve. So let me give you some examples of what that means. So again, most reps are presenting the features and benefits of their offering, but your prospects don't care about your features and benefits. What they care about is that you can solve the problems that they've discussed. That's all they care about. They don't care about all the bells and whistles. All they care about is, can this person solve the problems that I've mentioned in the earlier part of this conversation? And when you can demonstrate that you really understand their world better than their spouse does, and at the same time now show that you can you can demonstrate that you can solve the problems, now you have someone who's going to be really connected with what you're offering. And so they ultimately only care about solving the challenges that they're currently facing or that they're going to face. And so what this means is, don't like present the whole kitchen sink here. Keep the presentation super short. We'll talk about that in just a second, but like, you want to keep your presentations really tight and short and only show the stuff that they actually care about. Just give you an example. Like, so many of us have been in a selling situation before where we're like, the prospect is like in basically. And then we're like, oh, let me show you that one last thing. And they're like, actually, I don't really need that. And suddenly like you're like digging yourself out of it. You're like literally digging yourself out of a hole to undo what you just shared, because you're overwhelming them with information. The data shows that most salespeople are they're literally dumping too much information. So you can use case studies to ultimately connect what you do with what they need to fix. And so I shared with you early on in this presentation some case studies. So basically a case study is really simple. It's really just a story It doesn't have to be like a fancy PDF or anything you even show on a slide necessarily, but it's just like a story. It's like before, what you did, and then after. So like, what was their problem before? What did you do to solve it? And then what was the outcome, right? And what were the results that came out of it, right? Selling at 30% hit to goal, now at 200% to goal, right? That's the outcome. And so you don't have to, you want to use your stories and your case studies to really demonstrate that you know their world and what they're doing. And again, the vast majority of buyers just don't think that salespeople know enough about their world in order to help solve their problems. And that's why I talk about solving and this kind of presentation in a discovery conversation discussion, because it's such an important piece, because you need the discovery. The good discovery leads to that solving presentation. And just one little ninja kind of tidbit that I'll give you is that one thing that top performers do, and we see it over and over and over again in our community, is that top performers have really, really short presentations compared to average performers. Average performers like go on, they're just so excited to talk about all the crap that they have. Top performers have really short presentations, and what they then do is they're engaging the prospect in questions to let the prospect lead the rest of the presentation. So if your presentation is normally like, again, let's say it's a 45-minute sales call, 30 minutes for the traditional, of course, is like 10 minutes for discovery and 35 minutes for presentation. Now what we're going to do is we're going to flip that switch altogether. So it's going to be 30 minutes for discovery and then like 5 minutes for presentation. And this is the ninja thing. And then at the end of the presentation, if they're not already asking questions, you're like, okay, so I just wanted to give you the high level. What questions do you have for me about what I've just shared with you? And now you let them ask the questions, because they're going to ask questions about the stuff that they care about. That's the key, is that you're not like just like boring them with this insanely boring monologue, but instead you're letting their questions drive the conversation. That's the ninja stuff. That's the ninja stuff. So I hope that makes sense. So my last key here is that and it's so important, and I would be so remiss not to mention this, is we need to think like a top performer, because top performers simply think differently than everyone else. And you may already be a top performer. Awesome. You can still learn from other top performers, by the way. I don't know if you guys watched the Michael Jordan documentary, but in the Michael Jordan documentary, you've got all of these other Chicago Bulls players, and they're learning so much from Michael Jordan, right? These are all already top players, but there's so much that people at the top level can learn from one another. So we've got to think like other top performers. And so one is that most salespeople are so worried about building rapport and kind of pleasing the prospect that they're simply ultimately just kind of like going through a checklist during discovery. And we've got to drop the checklist crap, because the checklist is like, it's like, it's like the Sandler checklist, which no knock on that, but like, just, it's like, tell me more. What have you done to fix it? Why hasn't it worked? And it's like, that's good to ask those questions, but like, it shouldn't be a checklist. That's the idea of having a systematic approach, is like, you want to have the questions available, but you don't necessarily have to use them in a checklist fashion. Next is that you want to have a level of comfort with your process, so that way you can stop focusing on yourself and focus instead completely on them. Because what they say is so much more important than anything you have to say. And then if a prospect is ultimately being cagey, don't be afraid to say what you're thinking. So here's an example, and I think this will be really useful for a lot of folks, is like, if you have a prospect that's like, seems like they're not engaged, and like you shared something in your presentation, and you're like, yeah, so what our program will do is XYZ, and they're like, oh yeah, and a lot of salespeople would just push through that, but a top performer is going to be like, John, it seemed like that didn't really connect with you, or that didn't really resonate with you. Help me understand. Did I maybe miss something? And let them tell you. Don't be afraid to say what you're thinking. If your instinct, if your little spidey sense, if the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up, don't be afraid to just say it, because that's where the good stuff happens, right? Most salespeople ignore that stuff, And then they walk themselves into a think it over, where the prospect at the end is like, yeah, this is great, but I got to think about it. And meanwhile, they just want to get the hell off the phone. That's the key here. And then lastly is, this was one of my favorite sayings, but SW cubed N. Some will, some won't. So what next? Top performers don't get super emotional when they lose a sale. They don't get super excited when they win a sale. Some will, some won't. So what next? Who cares? And so, half of salespeople didn't even intend to go into the profession in the first place. So I know I've thrown a lot of information at you. So I just want to close out on a couple of quick questions for you, and then I can answer any questions that come out of this. But what separates the winners from the losers in sales, particularly in a conference like this? I would argue that it's about action. It's about actually taking action to move the ball forward with your selling. What are you going to do as a result of the ideas that I just shared with you? I hope you got some useful ideas. And obviously, just as a part of being in this conference in general, you've got to apply these ideas, because at the end of the day, you've got your plan, which sounds rosy and clean and beautiful, and then there's reality. And that's a bumpy path. And so, I always share with people, I always want to make sure that people know that they can take things further. So if you want to go further, if you resonated with what I said, would love to have you apply to the Sales Insights Lab Accelerator, which is our coaching program. It's our community. So, not a lot on that, but if you're interested in that, just go to the Lab Accelerator, labacceleratorapply.com. Again, that's labacceleratorapply.com. And then you can apply to our program. And I think Sarah can share that link with you. So we'd certainly love to have you apply to the program and have conversations down the road. So with that said, I'm happy to turn it over to any questions that have come out of this. And I will stop sharing my screen. And Sarah or Colin, are you guys
Yeah,
there?
I'm here.
Awesome.
I'll be honest, I did step away and grab a bite to eat.
Oh, you son of a bitch.
Yeah, I know. We've been online since like 7 a.m. So
Yeah, it's okay. I'm okay.
What are we, like 5.5 hours? I'm like, yeah, I probably should do that. But John had a question. John Seymour,
Sure.
Where are you, buddy? Let me just track it down here. Hey, Mark, could you provide some examples on best practices on providing value?
Yeah, I gave a couple before, but I think the big thing is you've got to have some ways to, we're big in presenting data. So there's a difference between giving a pitch or a demo up front, like a software demo. Like, no one wants to see your friggin' software demo. No one wants to see it. It's boring. Buyers don't care about demos. Like, they care about solving challenges, right? So a good example would be what we call the whiteboard pitch, which is, do you have some data that you can share on your prospect's industry that shows some insight? So it's like, like in this presentation, like I shared with you, like, okay, if I'm talking to the chief sales officer of a company, I'll be like, George, right now, a lot of the data tells us that basically 3/4 of salespeople are seen by buyers as ineffective and XYZ. And so, based on what I just shared with you, do any of those issues ring true to you, right? I truncated it, but it's like, you want to be able to share some real insight up front to engage the prospect in a conversation. And that can be much more in depth. On Zoom, we do a lot with screen share, where we literally will do like what we call a whiteboard pitch, where we're literally drawing out on a whiteboard, just kind of like showing a couple stats, key challenges that we're seeing, maybe some examples of organizations that have struggled with those issues, and then we're flipping the script and being like, okay, so now based on what I've shared with you, does any of that resonate with you? And get them to be like, yeah, actually. And by the way, it's only like 2 to 3 minutes. This isn't like a 25-minute thing. This is like 2 to 3 minutes showing your crap and then getting them to.